everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to the 2021 Summer Mini Skein mini-series. Every night this week, I will be releasing new yarn dyeing videos that feature mini skeins, and we're gonna have so much fun. One of the aspects of this series I am especially excited about is that we will be exploring multiple different yarn bases in most of the videos. So we will be looking at the same colorway but across different bases and looking at the similarities and differences that we see, and oh, it's gonna be so much fun. Before we jump into night one, please make sure that you're subscribed to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and have your notifications turned on so you don't miss any of the awesome content that's coming out this week or just in general. To kick off the series, I thought it would be really fun to create a colorway that is inspired by a very summery flower, the sunflower. And I also thought, why not do a solar dyeing type technique for this project? But there was one problem. I started filming this while it was still winter and would frequently hit below freezing outside at night. So we will be setting up our colorway in a mason jar technique, a technique very similar to what I would do for solar dyeing, but we're gonna do it as more of a cool vat, let it sit for a bit, and then heat set it. So let's go talk more about the project. Today we are gonna play with two different yarn bases. We've got Platinum DK, which is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And then we have Sheila's Sparkle, which is 75% superwash merino, 20% nylon, and 5% silver stellina. You can see it's sort of twinkling and sparkling in a very subtle way. And I just thought that it would be really, really fun to have that sparkle on our sunflower-inspired yarn. Today we are going to layer our minis and dye into these 8-cup mason jars. And I think we're gonna layer things in dry and then add the liquid in after the fact. And so I'm just trying to get a sense of how much I can fit in one of these jars. Certainly we can fit 200 grams, and I think a third 100. With water, things will compress more, so we're gonna try it. We're gonna try to fit 300 grams of yarn in here. Now, in the past when I've done this, I have seen very different results from DK and fingering weight yarn, both in terms of how they soak up water once I add the water to the pan, but also in terms of just how the colors absorb. I suppose those are related. So while Sheila's Sparkle is not the one I've used with this technique in the past, I'm very curious to see how it might end up. Since it is currently winter, even though I want to do, quote, solar dyeing, I'm not actually solar dyeing. I'm not going to be putting this outside because it would probably freeze. But I will be layering colors, setting it up in the mason jar like I would do solar dyeing. Let it sit for about 24 hours to give time for the dyes to dissolve and travel onto the yarn. And then, finally, what I will do is we will heat set the dye and yarn in the jars to set the color before we go and wash it and everything else. Before we go a little bit further into this project, I do want to quickly play with these colors on some yarn to get a feel of which yellows and brown and green I really want for this project. And this will help me decide how I want to layer the colors. The plan is to do some green towards, I think probably towards the bottom, then some yellow in an order I'm not quite sure if I'll do a more bright yellow followed by a more golden yellow, and then some brown towards the top. So that is the plan here. And then as the colors move throughout the yarn, there's going to be a randomness to how this all comes together. But what I've seen in the past is that there are absolutely ways that these could then be arranged into a beautiful fade set with potentially subtle, or given that I'm going to set this up in a more I guess, gradient type way versus randomly placing the colors as I layer it, you know, we'll have sort of a shift in tone. But that's the plan for how we're gonna layer in the jars. But first, let's just go check out the way that these different colors compare to each other on some yarn. On some Knit Picks Hawthorne fingering weight yarn, which is 80% fine Highland wool, 20% polyamide, I started playing with some greens in sour apple, emerald green, and avocado, some yellows, including brilliant yellow, sunflower yellow, golden poppy, and honey mustard, and then finally 2 more brown shades using pecan brown and golden straw. The goal here is not to have like an absolute understanding of how the colors might behave. Things might break differently in the jars than what I see in the pan, but it'll help me sort of narrow down into, I guess, 4 or 5 colors total that I want to use for this project. Don't forget that whenever you're playing with dry dye powders, to put on your safety equipment. I am wearing safety glasses, gloves, and a respirator mask with P100 filters right now. And all of the tools and equipment I am using are dedicated for dyeing yarn and are not ever used for the preparation of food. This is extraordinarily helpful. I think right off the bat, 2 colors that I am not going to include are the golden poppy and the emerald green. To be honest, didn't think that I wanted to use those, but I think that those for sure I'm not going to use. And then 3 others that I'm on the fence about are our golden straw, the pecan brown. I really want brown in there, but I think we have browns in some of these yellows. So I think I'll have to see what it feels like. And then the avocado, which absolutely breaks brown. So I'm inclined to include on some layers some mixtures of color, even though things are going to blend once we add water. All right, I'm formulating a plan. Let me go write this down. Okay, I think my plan, and I have to figure out how many minis I'll add at each stage, is to layer some sour apple and avocado on the first layer of yarn. Then we'll do some honey mustard, then sunflower, then a tiny amount of pecan brown. And then on top of the final bit of yarn, we'll add some brilliant yellow. And then either we'll add brilliant yellow or we might mix some brilliant yellow in with some water to pour on to add a little bit of color more all the way through. I think that's how I want to do it. The reason why, because otherwise, like if I was doing this, I might have swapped the pecan brown and brilliant yellow. Actually, maybe I should do that. Okay, I'm gonna swap the brilliant yellow and pecan brown, add a tiny amount of pecan brown to the very top. And then I think I'll get some brilliant yellow to dissolve in some of the water that I'm gonna pour on top, which is gonna add more of the yellow in. So then as the colors spread down, we're likely to end up with some brighter yellows in there. I think that's my plan. And so now let's go try to set it up. Meanwhile, I'm gonna let this heat for a little bit. I don't think, there's a little bit of color that hasn't absorbed yet. Maybe I will go ahead and add a little more water and acid. I started in here with 1 tablespoon of white vinegar in 4 cups of water, and so I'm now just adding another 2 cups of water and 1 tablespoon of white vinegar. And I'm gonna let this heat for 15 minutes or so and then cool off. I'm not planning on dyeing the other side. I'm gonna leave this as is. And so then we should be able to look at these colors a little bit in the end, and maybe it'll help us understand some patterns we see on our cold mason jar yarn, our faux solar dyed yarn. Before I get suited up again, I am going to start by adding 3 minis, very randomly but still twisted, to each of the jars. Maybe I'll try to have it a little more compressed. And so as we layer these dyes on, there will be like some blending between it, or it can all mix together. The fun thing about this is that you never quite know what you're gonna end up with. All right, let's do this. let's start with a tiny bit of avocado, which I have in here because I think, and I'm just getting a tiny bit, a true tiny bit. I'm mostly including this because I know it breaks, and so it might give us a surprise. Not that we'll definitely be able to tell that the surprise came from the avocado versus some browns coming down. Yeah, so we won't be able to predict exactly where that color came from, but you know, I think that it would, if it breaks into brown, I think that still works with our sunflower inspiration. And now with some sour apple. The goal is to avoid some large areas of color like I had there. This gets a little easier as we add more. I'm now going to bring the spoon in and just spread it out a little bit. I'm going to add a little more into here, mainly because if you have clumps that are a little too big, then they might not dissolve, and that could be hard. And I want to add a tiny bit more of this. There we go. Sort of get it spread out. All right, those are our greens. And that's the one layer where we're mixing two colors. And now I've got 3 more of our DK and 3 more of our sparkle minis. And, you know, not thinking a ton about how I'm placing them in. But now we're going to add some honey mustard. And it is mostly just randomly placed. Now the way that these minis are layered in here is going to vary because it's not that specific. So that can alter certainly the way the color is. But as I add, say, 3 more and push everything down, it does shift things a bit. So the sets that we're going to make out of this won't be identical. I don't think there's any way to make it identical, just because of the twists and then the way things are layered and the way that the dye is placed. This is sunflower yellow, which I had to find a way to use it because our inspiration are sunflowers. So it needed to be present. Okay. Now, in general, if I was touching the yarn, I wouldn't then go back in the jar. But since I didn't have another color up there, I felt reasonably comfortable doing so. The thing with adding dry dye powder like this is that you cannot be 100% sure how things are going to turn out. There's going to be an element of surprise. And so we just have to go for it and hope that we get something that fits our inspiration nicely. And hope that I didn't just add too much yarn so that way the colors don't spread very far at all. All right, now I've got our brilliant yellow, which is the one primary color that we have today. This I'm definitely going to want to break up on the yarn to help spread it out. And it's unclear to me how, quote, pure this might feel as we go through it. But I'm going to take some of this color, put it in this container, and we will dissolve that in some water in a moment. But before I do that, just going to spread out that dye a little bit, and we're going to add our final yarn in. Okay, now I feel like the fingering weight sparkle is not as compressed as what we have over here. So, but I don't want a lot of pecan brown. I just want, I'm actually going to use my fingers and just speckling on. And maybe after we pour the water on, we'll choose to add a tiny bit more, but I don't know. I certainly don't want to promise myself anything, but that is where we are going to leave off. All right, and I'm going to set that aside, and I am going to go get some warm tap water to start dissolving that dye. We will eventually add acid to everything, so don't worry about that. And I'm not worried about having perfectly dissolved dye here. And again, I'm not even measuring the amount because there is a randomness to this whole process. Okay, now the color, at least that I want to add at first, and let me scoot this down. I am going to start, let's see, I think I'm going to grab 2 tablespoons of this yellow mixture, which again, it's not so much that I'm measuring, I'm just aiming for some consistency between the 2 jars. But I am going to then fill up these cups to approximately the same amount. Approximately the same. And then we're going to start adding it here into the jar. And you can see how that turned brown and the rivers of color that are going through. Because it is not yet sinking in. That's why we only did a little bit of brown. It's not yet sinking in to the yarn that was not pre-soaked. It is running in these rivers down, but bringing some yellows with it. And actually this is going in faster than I expected, which is not bad. Okay, let's do that again, but let's do a bit more yellow. So let's do 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to get more water. And there might come a point where I decide to just add plain water with no dye in it into here. But adding some color in will help. Just spread some color all the way through. Now, my tap water is slightly acidic. So I am more likely to see color start to strike quickly than someone else. So I just wanted to point that out. But now I think I want to start adding some acid. Now there's a lot of dry space in these jars right now, like a lot of dry space. Okay, I just did 1 tablespoon in here, and I'm going to add more. Okay, adding just a little bit of yellow, and I'm going to fill this almost the whole way up to just start introducing some acid into each container. Now I could have been doing this with a less bright yellow, but what you see from what's happening with the brown, this is going to mix with those other colors and bring different pigments and hues throughout the whole thing. So that's why I'm adding this brighter yellow in, because if it was a more brown yellow, then it would shift things more brown. And so on that side it looks like it's pretty wet, but you can see over here it is still quite dry. So actually I'm just going to grab a cup full of plain tap water. This time, you know, there's no acid, no dye, and we're just going to start adding this. The color is sinking in faster than I see sometimes, which is nice. And the tap water I'm adding is warm. Not hot, but this shouldn't be a problem. But it's so funny how different things look, because we're mostly seeing this yellow and brown that's spread down through the outside. And adding the plain water did not alter things significantly, so that's good. I now have more water with another tablespoon of white vinegar. I think I'll probably keep adding maybe a tablespoon per 2 cups and adding some yellow to it. But I'm going to keep adding liquid to these jars until it looks like everything is really well saturated. And I might have to slow down at points because it is going to take some time for the liquid to soak in to some areas. But as we add more and more liquid and then wait sort of a moment, it's in some areas it's just soaking into the yarn, but in other areas it's sort of spreading down the sides, and so the level of water is slowly going up. It is so hard doing these types of projects because it's hard to know exactly how things might end up. It's hard to predict how the colors might spread and if it's going to feel unbalanced with a lot of colors that feel really similar, so we don't get a fade set. But ultimately, whenever I've taken things out in this kind of way, I've usually been able to arrange it and think, ooh, what a really fun fade. So I believe that that's where we will be able to end up. But that doesn't mean I don't feel nervous about this along the way. As I was adding liquid to the jars, I made sure to add enough vinegar so that way there is a total of 3 tablespoons of vinegar in each of these 8-cup jars. And especially towards the end, I had to add liquid and then wait a moment because it was taking more time for that dye to sink in. I could see some bubble pockets where the dye had not yet moved, and I wanted to give it a little bit of time before poking it to assist that color going through. Because part of the fun of this is just the absolute randomness of the colorway. There are a couple of air pockets, which I'm not sure how well you guys can see on camera, but I am going to poke and just at this point, because it's been a while, allow some of that liquid to travel down. You don't have to do that, obviously, but this is my choice because this is also helping me see if I need to add more liquid. Now I want to make sure that there is enough liquid for all the yarn to be saturated. It's just going to take some time for all of that saturation to happen. And I think especially just around the neck of the jars, that's where some of these pockets can end up. But in doing that, I feel like I can get a tiny bit more water. And so we have enough water, and there's going to be pockets in there still. And what we really don't know, like we can see what's going on with the edges, and I can see green and brown, and in some areas I can feel some like there's one over here, some more orangey hints. But we know more of that orangey color is in the middle. The question with this is always, did I add enough? Did I add enough of those more orange tones, or did I go a little too light with it? And that's something that we won't know until we remove the yarn. Now, there is always an option to over dye the yarn if you don't like the results or if you wish that there was more pigment. I am excited to see where this goes and where this ends up. So now let's go find the lids. So I am going to add lids for these mason jars, and I'll wipe down the outside of the jars, but then I'm going to set them aside to sit for at least 24 hours. And then we'll remove the lids and sort of heat set the yarn as is in the jars. I realized I hadn't shown the yarn from the side at all really, but here is the yarn a couple of hours after I put it in the jars. And it is so fun. Oof, I am so curious what it looks like. Why do I want to wait before I add more heat? And that's mainly because I'm trying to mimic the slow spread and slow absorption that we get with solar dyeing, which allows some of these colors to move more. Now, granted, a lot of the movement does happen from pouring the water on top of it. You could see on there these rivers of brown that we got from just adding the water on top of that pecan brown, which was really, really fun and cool. There will be patches of color because of the way the yarn is in between and sort of pressed together. There will be paths for water to go based on the twist of the skein. And that is one element that we could absolutely go and heat set right now. But giving the yarn some time to equilibrate a little bit and letting that happen slowly and giving there to be a chance for potentially some color to move through as it finds paths also gives a little bit of time to have some beauty. Now, I could have set up more in this kind of colorway in some smaller jars, but I think I'm gonna stick with this, and depending on how this comes out, we might then do another round very, very similarly. But of course it wouldn't be exact, because when you're not measuring the dye as you're adding it, then it makes it hard to have something huge and reproducible. But that's why I'm glad I decided to add yellow over the whole thing, because at the very least, and I'm like peering at the jars right now, it looks like we'll have a little bit of that bright yellow along the whole thing. 24 hours later, here are the jars. We have high amounts of green at the bottom. I see some hints in both of our more orange yellow, but otherwise a lot of that doesn't seem to be apparent. Maybe that's all sort of tucked in between, but there's rivers of yellow and white. Here's a little bit of some of that white and brown down along the outside, which I'm very excited about. This is the first time I've been moving them around in any kind of way. But look at the way that those greens have spread out. And I do see evidence of some breaking, probably from that avocado down below. I picked it because I thought it would help bring some like earthiness to some of those greens. But now, what I'm gonna do, they sealed a little bit. I am going to remove the lids, and we need to heat set this. Now there's a few ways that we could proceed. I could remove all the yarn from here and then heat set it that way. But if there's undissolved dye, potentially things could spread. And there might still be undissolved dye when we go and remove the yarn from this to wash it. That's something that can happen later on. But I'm gonna heat set it in the jars. So over here, I have a pasta insert for my larger 12-quart dedicated dye pot. And I'm gonna use this to provide a water bath to heat up the dye in the jars. And what we'll be doing is, I'm not gonna be able to raise the water all the way up to here because the edge of the pot is down here, but I'm gonna add this to the pot on the stove, fill it up, so there's a lot of coverage of water, and then we'll start heating it up. So our water level is all the way down there, but we're gonna start heating things up. I've got the pot on high, and I'm gonna keep an eye on it. I want the yarn to be exposed to heat for at least 30 minutes, but it's gonna take a while for the temperature in the pot to come up. I am going to put on a lid to help keep the heat and everything trapped in. So I'm going to check in I think 30 minutes, and we'll see how we're doing on heating things up. After 30 minutes on a high heat, it is definitely steamy. And let me just check. The water in the jars is warm, but I would describe it as lukewarm, not yet hot. It's going to take time. So I'm going to go ahead and set a timer for another 15 minutes, because I think then we might start to be boiling. All right, after about 10 minutes, we are now boiling in the bath, and you can see we've got some movement in the jars, but I am now going to cover this. I will reduce the heat so it's not at quite such a heavy boil. The reason why we have the jars inside the pasta insert instead of on the bottom of the pot is that way the glass doesn't heat up too much and potentially crack. So I found that this works very much like a canning pot, even though it's not a canning pot. But you could use some kind of canning pot. Anyway, I am going to let this heat for 30 minutes now. All right, it has been 30 minutes and things are nice and hot. I have just turned off the heat. And I think what I want to do, making sure the edges aren't too hot, is remove the pasta insert so that way things can cool off a little faster than if we left them in the bath. So I am going to lift this up and carry it over to the sink to set it down. It's still going to take a while to cool because these jars are very, very warm, but the whole process will go faster since they are again, not in that bath. If you wanted to apply more heat, you could let everything cool off in the bath really, really slowly. That is another completely viable option. And I mean, if I could handle the jars comfortably, I could try to remove the minis now so we could get a reveal. But I'm gonna wait until maybe the jars will still be slightly warm when we start to remove the minis, but I need it to be cool enough that I can comfortably handle it. It's been a couple of hours now and things are still warm, but I am curious. Oof, that's pretty. That's from the top. I really like a little bit of brown. So here we've got a little bit more of a golden yellow. There's still some hints of brown. So those are very subtle differences. This is definitely more gold as we go further down. We'll see what everything looks like opened up. Ooh, now we've got some gold and green, and then finally some bits of green, which I think is really, really pretty. Potentially subtle. Potentially I needed to add some more of the golden yellow, but we'll see. This is still warm. I want to let it cool. The water in here is completely clear. The jar is still warm, so I'm going to let it cool before we set up another one. But I also want to open this up and look at it before we set up another. But let's look at the sparkle colorway while I set this aside. Okay. Here is some of our on top with yellow and brown. I feel like the brown traveled down a lot more. So we've got some brighter yellow, probably from where I had that yellow powder. I do see some golden notes. I think that the amounts that I added of those golden yellows was not enough. Although, now I'm seeing more. Maybe it's that the brown with the sunflower yellow is not that different from yellow with little hints of brown. So maybe there is that. Those are really pretty. Really pretty. And then there's one more green one down here. So again, I'm gonna let this cool. This one feels a little denser. I brought some more liquid into it. We definitely, without question, do have a gradient. Some of those lighter colors might be fairly subtle. The water in here is clear. I want to give all the yarn a chance to cool completely before we open it up and see what we want to see and how balanced or unbalanced it is. It's possible that we've got yellow and brown, more pure yellow, yellow and orange, and then yellow and green, which is what I was going for. So I think that this looks great so far. Potentially with thicker yarn, maybe I'd want a little more green further up, but I'm very excited to see where this goes. I unwrapped the sparkle set and sort of arranged them in what I thought would be approximately a fade order. This is something that I'll do all over again once the yarn is dry, but I thought that it would be really, really fun to get a feel of the color progression now, especially because I want to set up some more. I think that this progression is really, really fun. We have a little bit more brown hits, then we go into a brighter yellow, then we get some hints of orange, and then some hints of green. I think I'm inclined to move the honey mustard a little bit higher up, be above the sunflower yellow, because I don't mind if some of that gets drawn down a bit more. I think on this one it's fine because there's a lot more white towards the top than there is towards the bottom, so we still have a very nice fade in here. We'll be able to turn this into 3 really, really lovely fades. I just think that that might break up some of the things a little bit, especially then as we add more green. Not that this feels bottom heavy. I think that this is still a very, very awesome progression. But let's go and open up the DK. Oh, and I'm going to go and collect probably using 7 or 8 at a time of these 20-gram mini skeins and put them on to a reusable nylon zip tie, trying to make sure to keep it ordered because this will help with the washing. I see a lot of potential in the DK as well. Certainly one of the skeins got a bit of the brunt of the brown. I can make sure when I layer more yarn in that I make sure that there's a range of skeins at the top so that more of them get some of that brown. But I really like this. It really does feel, if I were to call this sunflower, you would say, yeah, sure, of course. So I'm very, very, very happy. And now let's open it up. In the past, I've seen some instances of colors mix really, really differently on DK and fingering weight yarn. This time, the differences don't feel as extreme, at least right off the bat they don't. But I think that there's a huge part this time in that colors were layered as one on each level versus being present and a little more mixed and layered throughout the jar, and so therefore some of the mixing didn't really have as much of a chance for things to go upward. Things went downward. So I'm curious when we compare this next to the fingering weight one in the very end, if it feels different or not. I feel like when I lay it out, when it's dry and we try to separate this, sort of like using every third skein or something, we will absolutely feel more balance. A lot of these feel very similar, but there's more brown, less brown. There's less yellow in the interior than what we saw on the fingering weight. So yeah, I think that I want to move the honey mustard further up. But otherwise, again, I'm really, really happy. Let's wash the sparkle yarn. I actually already washed the DK off camera, and so I know that it doesn't bleed, but I just wanted to show you. Oh. Sometimes scheduling permits different kinds of activities when I'm filming. I just added some clear dish soap, and that is no color coming out. I am so happy with how this has turned out. And I even have a little sunflowery thing that I will show at the end of the video that I have made for part of this summer mini skein mini series this year. But anyway, I'm gonna rinse out the soap, put the yarn through my spin dryer, and then hang it up to dry. But oof, look at that sparkle. I put my respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves back on and started layering these sunflower colors into 2 different jars. Again, This time the fiber content's a little bit different. In one jar, I had a mixture of Donegal DK, which is 85% superwash merino, 15% nap, and then titanium sock, which is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And then in the other jar, I had more of this Sheila's Sparkle, which again is 75% superwash merino, 5% silver stellina, and 20% nylon, with a little bit of that titanium sock mixed in. Each time I'm adding 3 skeins, there's 2 of one base and then 1 of that titanium sock in there. I'm curious how the titanium socks will compare to one another out of the jars. So that's sort of one piece here, but also, if doing it this way, is that going to lead to a fade set that I'm going to be happy with? The nice thing about having 10 of these titanium socks between the 2 jars is that I can swap things between those 2 sets in the end. But I'm, again, just really curious how this will turn out. As for the colors, I started with a combination of sour apple and avocado. Then after the next layer, I added sunflower yellow. The next layer, I did honey mustard. The next layer, brilliant yellow. And then finally, a tiny bit of pecan brown speckling on the very top. I mixed some brilliant yellow with some water and added some of this really dilute yellow into each jar before then starting to add some acid. Aiming to have at least 3 tablespoons of white vinegar per 8 cups of water in each of the 2 jars. Then I set these jars aside to sit for 24 hours. After waiting 24 hours, I heat set the yarn on the stovetop using that large pasta insert. And then once things cool, then we started to open them up. As I opened up the skeins from these last 2 jars, I was so excited to see the fades we got, even with mixing different yarn bases in one jar. Because we added the dyes to the containers in an asymmetric way, that really came through with what we saw in the yarn, and I'm absolutely in love with the sunflower colorway. So I went ahead and washed the yarn off camera, and thankfully there was no bleeding. So now let's go take a look at the finished dry yarn and these sunflower fade sets. Before we looked at our dry sunflower gradients, I thought it would be fun to look at our swatches and see how these colors turned out. We have sour apple, emerald green, avocado, golden poppy, brilliant yellow, and then pecan brown over there. And then we have golden straw, sunflower yellow, and honey mustard. And looking at the colors dry, now of course, what did I have to remember what I used? I think I used honey mustard, sunflower yellow, and brilliant yellow, which dry are the combination I would use. And then we used sour apple, a little bit of avocado, which you see breaks and has a little bit of brown in it. And then we also used a hint of the pecan brown. Here are some from our first 2 jars, and then from our next batch, just crudely laid out. And I think that swapping the order of that honey mustard and sunflower yellow did help with the overall balance. And I'm gonna go ahead and I think I'm gonna lay out all of the sparkle yarn from both of the batches. There are a few things that I did differently the second time around. This is missing the titanium sock skeins that I had removed from that batch, which is why the set over on the right looks smaller. But I think that moving that honey mustard up, so having it sort of in the order more up here, really does help with the overall balance. I think that when I split that side over into 3, I think that when I split the side over into 3 full fade sets, it's still gonna look really awesome. But a little tweak, I think, made some difference that I really enjoy. They're just different. but I still feel very sunflowery. I probably could still have pumped the dye up a little bit more. And who knows, I might be dyeing some more sets of this colorway for the Summer Mini Skein mini series. But now I'm going to go ahead and twist up all of these minis and all of the DK, which are very, very similar from when we unwrapped them to the sparkle minis over on the left. Just the penetration is slightly different, and I think there might be a little more white just because of the way the color is absorbed into the yarn. With all 4 jars laid out as I guess I can assemble these fades, you can really see how I moved up that honey mustard. But the other thing that I think is interesting is that when adding skeins 3 at a time and adding the dye, even with pouring the liquid on, there's good parity between the different bases. Yes, there might be some differences in the total saturation of colors, but there is some level of consistency that really impresses me. Coming over to our last 2, we have some outliers here. There are 2 sets of a non-sparkle titanium sock that I did, and so here is one. And I'm gonna have to look closely to find the non-sparkle yarn. I attempted to put them in where they seemed to fit the best. So again, I see some good parity between our Donegal DK. And wow, these are pretty well matched. I mean, it stands to reason when we're adding the same colors every couple of rounds, but still, you never know when you're randomly layering things, how things might turn out. And so I think that it's great to see that you can mix different bases in the jar and still get something that feels like a complete color story from that. The other thing I want to say is I love this colorway on this Donegal DK base. I think especially since my inspiration is sunflowers, these neps that are in brown and black really shine and make you think of the seeds. Or, well, goodness, if you hang up a dried sunflower head as a bird feeder, what happens all around the patio when the birds go to town? So I really enjoy this on all of the 4 bases I've tried it on so far. And now I am going to shift everything into what I guess we'd have 12 different fade sets. And the way I plan to go about this is to, for example, pick every 3rd skein, and then when I see the skeins from a batch, maybe I'll swap some out if I think that's needed to create something complete. And for, say, these ones, I will pick every other out. And again, look to see, oops, shift it like that, if it feels complete. And then maybe think, oh, maybe I want to shift one that is more orange for one that is a little less orange up there, and just sort of make them so it feels like they're as perfect as I can get them. I don't think the wide shot really does this justice. There's a subtlety to these fades, and I think that this would just make really fun, delightful socks. And I love it with the sparkle. You can feel the sunshine in there. So I really hope that if you are unwrapping one of these that you love it. But man, this Donegal DK is just, ooh, so good. I'm really glad that I dove into this technique, even though it is still winter as I am filming this and it is below freezing outside. So I can't actually do solar dyeing, but the technique and I think the results mirror pretty closely. Now, it could be possible, and it could be worth exploring, whether there are differences in how the colors travel if I'm going to leave one inside at room temperature versus outside when it's 80, 90 degrees with the heat of the sun coming on it. it's possible that there are some differences. And I mean, I suppose, well, one could control for that by putting it in a pot, but maybe that's an experiment that's worth doing. I doubt we'd see a huge difference. I have a feeling, my hypothesis is that most of the dyeing movement that happens from pouring the liquid over the dye. And so that movement from just the yarn soaking up all this liquid has a huge impact on the way that the colors move. But I mean, I can't say for 100%. It's possible that there could be some differences and that with more heat, things could move more or strike faster and move less. So I guess we wouldn't know until we try. But what we did see is that setting this up in 2 jars, we did get very similar amounts of coverage in like the 2 cases that I set up side by side. I switched the order of the colors, so the first 2 aren't the same as the second 2, but I am willing to give this another shot and another try to see if we see colors spread more or less. So if this is something you would be interested in, let me know in the comments down below. And I picked a very yellow heavy type of colorway today. What other colors would you like to see me play with? I love hearing your color suggestions, and they really do influence the direction I go with all of these videos. I absolutely love how this yarn turned out, and I'm really surprised with ultimately how reproducible this technique is. Even though I did switch the colors around, but a lot of the colors between jars ended up feeling very, very similar. And I just am really excited with how it turned out, and really I always want to play with this technique more. So please let me know down in the video description if you want more solar dyeing, or maybe I should just call it mason jar dyeing instead. As part of the Summer Mini Skein mini-series, I did sell mystery sets that come from one of the videos. And the little project bags that I made are actually inspired by the sunflower as well. These bags feature the yarn that is part of the ChemKnits logo and some beautiful summery petals that I actually drew myself. And then I even used the same sunflower as the yarn label for the various sets so people could know when to open them up. There were some other fun extras, including a ChemKnits project keeper, which is now available in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop in limited quantities. I wanted to share these bags because I'm really, really proud of how they turned out. And it's really fun to, a couple times a year, dye a lot more yarn than I normally do, so that way more people can enjoy and play with the colorways. So I hope that if you just opened up night 1 that you really love your yarn. The Summer Mini Skein mini-series sets are sold out, but there are some yarn mops from this series that will be added to the shop over the course of this week. And there's hand-dyed yarn featured in hundreds of other ChemKnits videos. So you can bring home some beautiful hand-dyed yarn and now add a ChemKnits logo project keeper to your order. You can find links to everything down in the video description. I know ultimately these series are all about the yarn, but I really do have a lot of fun designing and creating fun extras to just add to the whole experience. Again, please make sure that you're subscribed to the channel. Subscribing, liking, and commenting and engaging with these videos is the biggest way that you can support the content here. And make sure you stay tuned, because every night this week there will be a new Summer Mini Skein mini-series video coming out at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. There will be a playlist linked below that will contain all of these videos in case you miss a night, but I'm really excited for you to see all of the different colorways that I created for this week. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching!